Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Northern Forest Bird Network webinar series. We are so happy to have JT Larkin here today. Just a little backstory. JT gave a presentation for nightjars with the American Bird Conservancy in the fall, and he did such a wonderful job. I was like, we got to bring him on to our webinar series here, and he has his research with whippoorwills. So I'll just give a little bio and then I'll let him take it away. So JT Larkin is an SAF candidate certified forester and a Massachusetts licensed forester. He's a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he earned his bachelor's in biology and minor in GIS at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, and master's in forest resources at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. JT's master research focused on understanding eastern whippoorwill while in response to forest management. After earning his master's, JT worked as a habitat biologist for Mass Wildlife, where he planned public and private land habitat management. The focus of his current PhD research involves exploring novel ways to incorporate remote sensing technologies into conservation science to inform forestry and wildlife habitat management. And during his free time, JT enjoys hunting, fishing, and taking hikes with his wife, Haley, and dog, Benny. So thank you so much, JT, for taking the time to give us this presentation. And I will also be posting in our chat a SAF and the Wildlife Society credits if you need those. So please fill out that form. But if you have any questions, please throw those in the chat, and I'm hopefully we'll have time at the end to have a discussion. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. Um, Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I'm excited to talk with you all about this cool species, the eastern whippoorwill, and my research on the eastern whippoorwill. So if we take a look at eastern forests, we see that they're extremely diverse, right? Over 6,000 different plant species, tens of thousands of insects, over 250 birds, and so on. And this diversity can really be tied back to our early eastern forests. And these forests exhibited millennia of disturbance, forest dynamics, so periodic disturbance and natural processes. So we had disturbances such as fire, wind events like tornadoes. We had stand disturbing wildlife that were prevalent, like the American beaver and passenger pigeon, on top of natural processes such as forest succession, all made our forests very structurally complex. And from a wildlife standpoint, we can think of structural complexity as niche space. So some of us may be familiar with this figure here. This is created based on a publication by MacArthur in 1958. And basically, this is just showing that these five warbler species are exhibiting niche differentiation. They have their own niche space they're filling, and they're all foraging in different parts of the same tree species. So in this case, a spruce. And we can think about our eastern forest very similarly to the tree in this example here. So um, we have we had early, mid, and late successional forests. And a great way to look at our eastern forest. So these are all different portions of that tree in the last example there. We can think about the niche spaces that are available pretty easily with birds. So we have birds that are early, mid, and late successional species, and we can further divide these out into low, mid, and upper strata species. So we can see here how all these species, these nine, just these nine that are pictured here actually, exhibited niche differentiation. They're all filling their own niche space. They co-evolve with millennia of disturbances, the complexity that came with them to fill their roles. Um, However, in one fell swoop, we lost the complexity of our eastern forests with the clearing, forest clearing. And what has since grown back is this very homogeneous in structure forest. Um, and if we take a look at the age class distribution of this forest, we see that we have a lot of middle-aged forest and not a lot on either of the bookends. So we have less than 2% between 0 and 15-year-old forests and less than 2% over 125-year-old forests. Further simplifying our forests, we have factors such as invasive species, whether it be plants or insects, generational high grading, overabundant deer populations or deer populations that are out of balance with the landscape, and the suppression of disturbances, not just natural disturbances like fire, but also anthropogenic disturbances such as timber harvesting, like we've seen in the state of Massachusetts, where there's been a moratorium on timber harvesting over the past few years. And consequently, we've seen the decline of many eastern forest wildlife, and birds are really the poster child of these declines. And eastern forest birds are among some of the most rapidly declining species groups. I'm certain we're all pretty familiar with the article by Rosenberg et al. That chronicled the decline of nearly 3 billion birds over the past half century. Stemming from these declines is the fact that several eastern forest burns are now the focus of habitat-centric conservation efforts. And these conservation efforts are informed by best management practices, such as what we see in this slide here. And I'm certain many of us have actually used these habitat management guidelines or referenced them in some of our work. And they've been implemented across private lands in the eastern US for species such as the golden wing warbler and New England cottontail through NRCS's Working Lands for Wildlife, and then also through for cerulean warbler through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program by NRCS. But we're also seeing them implemented on our public lands as well. Now, oftentimes we see the monitoring of focal species response to these conservation efforts. We want to understand how effective the management that we're implementing is for these focal species. However, what we see a lot less often is monitoring of non-target species that may also benefit from these management efforts. And a great example of this is the eastern whippoorwill. The eastern whippoorwill is a nocturnal aerial insectivore that inhabits the forests of eastern North America, as we can see here in this range map. The blue is its wintering season distribution, and the orange is its breeding season distribution. So, as we can see in this range map, it's really covers the breeding season distribution really covers the eastern half of the U.S. And during its time on the breeding grounds, the species really requires diverse forest conditions, ranging from early successional to mature forests. Before I get too down the rabbit hole on the species in terms of very scientific stuff, I want to talk a little bit about how unique this species is. For those who are unfamiliar with the song, it has a three-part song where it just repeats its name over and over. And if we take a look at this individual here, we see that it has this cool mottled black and brown coloration that allows it to blend in with its surroundings really well, whether it's sitting on the forest floor or perched up in a tree. And if we take a look at some of the features near this guy's head, we see those whiskers right here, this large beady eye, and then a deceivingly large mouth. So what I mean by this is if we take a look at these pictures here, we can see this large beady eye and just how large that mouth actually is. And these features are used to capture its insect prey as it sallies through the air at night. And its primary food source is moths and beetles. Whippoorwill typically have a clutch size of 2, and what emerges from those eggs is this alien-like creature that only a mother really could love, right? It's pretty cool looking. And something that's really cool about the eastern whippoorwill is that its ecology is really closely tied to the lunar cycle. It forages, and it's most effective at foraging whenever you have high lunar illumination, and it actually times its nesting with in the eggs hatching with the lunar cycle as well. So it lays its eggs during one full moon cycle, and then those eggs hatch, and the chicks are very needy as the next full moon is coming. So whenever the parents are most effective, efficient foragers. So what I mean by this, so if we have this example here, this is kind of just a silly illustration, but I think it does a great job at showing why the species needs young force in terms of foraging. If we have this moth that flies across this site, and you have the whippoorwill sitting down there on the log. There's a layer of vegetation between the whippoorwill and the moth, or potentially between the moth and the moon, right? Um, However, if you have forest management, that moth flies across that landscape. The whippoorwill is able to backlight it, sit in a location where it can see its prey fly in front of the moon and sally upwards and capture it. So while this species is a really cool species to study, it's also a really important species to study. It's been experiencing significant population declines over the past half century, and is a species of greatest conservation need on many state wildlife action plans within its breeding season distribution. And really the two main factors contributing to the species decline is reduced food availability. So I'm certain we've all seen probably the articles that are something titled something like the insect apocalypse. Without a doubt, this would have an influence on insectivorous bird species, but also habitat loss and degradation. And this is really thought to be the primary driver of the species decline. And we can think of this not so much in terms of forest conversion, right, from forest to a non-forest land cover, but rather forest succession. So young forest is created on the landscape through some sort of disturbance. That forest then goes through natural succession and matures into a closed canopy forest. And then no new young forest is being created on the landscape. Now, whenever it comes to monitoring eastern whippoorwill, surveys typically follow a protocol similar to that of the Nightjar Survey Network. And this survey is a large-scale volunteer-based survey for all nightjar species across the U.S., not just the whippoorwill. And this protocol has several constraints. The species is crepuscular or active at night as well. So the surveys naturally have to occur at night. They are confined to two-week survey windows centered around the lunar cycle. So we have a rather short window to survey whippoorwill. Oftentimes, these surveys take place along roadsides. So if you take a look at this image here, we can see that all of these points actually fall along a navigable roadway. And we know that forest management oftentimes occurs well away from roads. They only occur for 6 minutes once a year, and they're dependent upon optimal weather conditions. So all of these factors together really make large-scale monitoring very logistically difficult. So oftentimes our study areas are much smaller than what we'd ideally hope for. Now there is technology available that can help facilitate studying species that are tricky to monitor, such as GPS collars, such as what we see in this picture of the elk, camera trapping, such as what we would potentially use to monitor a small mammal species. And then also for birds, we have autonomous recording units or ARUs. And what's pictured here is an audio moth by Open Acoustic Devices. So ARUs are used to monitor species via auditory cues. So we can think of vocalizations such as an owl calling, or a prairie warbler singing, but also other auditory cues like drumming from this woodpecker. And this technology is really growing in popularity as the technology itself, the analysis of its data, and the cost of these units are becoming more user-friendly. Additionally, ARUs collect a ton of data compared to a traditional point count. So if we think back to whippoorwill surveys, a survey takes place for only 6 minutes a year. ARUs can be deployed at a site and monitor a site for a species for hundreds of hours across a given breeding season. So we're really able to get a good understanding of whether a site was occupied or not. And for those that are wondering what it takes to monitor a single site with an ARU, here's everything you need. You have your ARU. In this case, it's an audio moth again. There are other devices such as those by Wildlife Acoustics, like the Song Meter Micro. This unit is powered by 3 AA batteries, and the recordings are stored on this micro USB card. We program it on a computer, and then we can deploy it at a site. So we can hang it up on a tree, and it will last for about 180 hours worth of recording. So now I'm going to start moving into how I used ARUs to monitor eastern whippoorwill across the eastern US. So my master's research had two main objectives. First was to assess whippoorwill occupancy across a gradient of forest management intensity, and second was to identify landscape and site level characteristics that influence whippoorwill occupancy. To complete these objectives, we surveyed 1,263 survey locations ranging from western North Carolina to southern Maine. And these were deployed across both public and private land sites that were treated with a variety of silvicultural prescriptions, ranging from mature unmanaged forests, so passive management, shelter woods, overstory removals, and clear cuts. And These images here are really just a snapshot in time, right? All of our sites varied structurally. We had some shelter woods that were fresh, some that were 5 years old or 10 years old. Same with overstory removals and clear cuts. So we had great variation across our sites, and we monitored all these sites with ARUs. To give you an idea of what these sites kind of look like in terms of basal area range, here's just a simple bar plot. The number of sites are on the y-axis, and the basal area range is on the x-axis. And just for ease of breaking this up, we have the different treatments here. So all these bars that fall underneath the yellow line are representative of clear cut or overstory removal. The blue line is a shelterwood, and then the black line is the mature unmanaged forest. So you can see that we have a pretty good sample from each of these basal area ranges. At these sites, again, whippoorwill surveys are taking place during two-week survey windows annually. So we programmed our units to record for 2 hours a day from 9 to 11 o'clock at night, which is a period when whippoorwill are noted to be vocally active, and then deployed them to capture at least one of the two whippoorwill survey windows. After these units had been out at the site recording, I returned back to the lab with returned back to the sites with my crew to collect the units and conducted a quick vegetation survey. So we wanted to quantify site level vegetation characteristics around each ARU location. So stem density, regenerating species composition, basal area, ground cover, and so on. After we collected all the units, I returned back to the lab and started processing landscape level data. So I wanted to quantify landscape level data sets like the National Land Cover data set and FIA Forest Type Groups data set at several spatial extents around each ARU location, ranging from 250 meters to 1,750 meters radius. And these went up by 250 meter increments. And this is just to assess what the landscape was like around these units. So we wanted to know, was it mostly forest, or was there some agriculture or urban land cover in the landscape? And also, if it was mostly forest, what type of forest was surrounding these units? Once we had those data, I was ready to start processing our recordings. And over the course of the two field season, we collected over 60 terabytes worth of data, or 140,000 hours worth of recording. And this is equivalent to about 16 years worth of straight listening. And since it's not feasible for a master's student to sit there and listen through 140,000 hours worth of recordings and assess them all for whippoorwill, we had to develop a machine learned classifier. And what this is essentially training the computer to identify the image of a whippoorwill song, which is what we have here. So all these black squiggles are the whippoorwill singing. So we went through and identified a bunch of clips with whippoorwill singing on them, and like so. And then physically drew a box around those whippoorwill songs in the program Raven Pro. And we did this for hundreds of clips, just to teach the computer every possible way it could come across a whippoorwill song, whether it was really close to the unit or really far away. Perhaps there was a frog singing over top of it as well. We wanted to train it every possible way it could potentially come across a whippoorwill song. And then we tested it on a known data set to assess its performance. And once we were satisfied with the classifier's performance, we ran it on our real data set. And whenever we do this, it chunks all of our recordings up into 5-second clips and generates a score for each of those clips. And that score is essentially a likelihood. It's just the higher the score, the more likely it is that it contains a whippoorwill song. So I went through and I listened through a few thousand of these clips, and then assessed those clips whether a whippoorwill was singing on the clip or not. And I found that at a score of 4.3 was our highest scoring non-whippoorwill clip. So it's the highest scoring false positive. So knowing this score, we're able to quickly assess site occupancy. So anything greater than 4.3, a clip greater than 4.3 was assessed as a occupied clip. So knowing this, we were able to apply what's called a threshold approach. So if we take a look at this unit here, we see that on day one, this is the highest scoring clip for each day. So on day one for this site, the highest scoring clip was 2. So this site on day one would be assessed as unoccupied. On day two, it was 18.2. It's greater than 4.3, so we assess it as occupied. And we can quickly do this for our site, right? So now we have a detection history, and we can do this for all of our survey locations. So now we have detection histories for all of our survey locations. And again, this is called a threshold approach. There are other approaches that you can use, such as listening down. But for the whippoorwill and for this study, the threshold approach worked best. Of our ARUs that we deployed out there in the landscape, 70 of them failed to collect any data. And this was for a variety of reasons, but the most common were bear damage. We had bears that really liked our ARUs and liked to tear them down. And then also, interestingly, spiders, ants, and caterpillars like to chew holes in the bags. They find these plastic bags as nice homes. And then, of course, whenever there's a hole in the plastic bag and it rains, those bags fill with water and it fries the unit. So we lost 70 units um, uh, because of some of these reasons. So of the units that collected data, so there was 1,263 units that collected data in our study. 399 had whippoorwills singing on them. So we had a 32% naive occupancy. So using this occupancy information and occupancy modeling, I'm not going to go too in depth on our analyses today, but I will just give a brief overview. We ran a preliminary single season occupancy analysis where a site was considered occupied if it had 2 whippoorwill detections that were at least 10 days apart. And this is based off of a criteria by Bibby 2000. And whenever we ran this single season occupancy analysis, we found that after only 4 days of recording, our detection probability was nearly 1. So our sites had to have at least 10 days of recording. So our detection was 0.9999 repeating. So we had nearly perfect detection, which eliminates the need for accounting for detection. And we can use generalized linear models then. So using generalized linear models and regional landscape and site level variables, we're able to identify covariates that influence whippoorwill occupancy. And just want to go over some of our predictions. First is we predicted that as forest area in the landscape increased, so would the probability of a whippoorwill occupying the site. This is a forest bird species, so we'd expect it to be associated with forest. Second is that forest type would matter. And specifically, whippoorwill would have a positive association with drier forest types, such as oak forests. Third is that whippoorwill would have a negative association with imperviousness or urban land covers. Fourth is that whippoorwill would have a positive association with young forest or scrub shrub in the landscape. So this is a young forest dependent species. And finally, was basal area. So as basal area, a negative relationship with basal area. So as basal area would increase, the probability of having whippoorwill occupy the site would decrease. So now I'm going to move into some of my results. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll go over some of the most important. First was basal area. So all of my figures are going to follow the same format today. We have occupancy probability on the y-axis and our predictor variable on the x-axis. These lines down here are sampling locations. So representative, each line is representative of a site And then we have our trend line with 95% confidence intervals, and our mean probability of occupancy is the red dotted line. You don't have to read too hard into this. It's really, you just need to look at the overall trend of the line here. And what we see is that as basal area increases, the probability of having a whippoorwill occupy the site decreases. So we have a negative relationship with basal area. And this makes sense for a young forest dependent species. Next is the amount of oak forest in the landscape. So as percent oak forest within 1,500 meters of a survey location increased, the probability of having a whippoorwill occupy the site also increased. So a positive relationship. And this is kind of an important thing to note because our oak forests are in a lot of trouble. And if we want to conserve the species, we have to really focus on creating healthy and resilient oak forests. Whippoorwill primary food source, moths, are highest in diversity and abundance in oak forest. So we'd expect the species to be most have the highest occupancy in landscapes with where their food source is also highest in diversity and abundance. Our third variable was the amount of shrub in the landscape or young forest, and this had a quadratic effect that peaked at about 10% in the landscape. But as you can see here, our sites kind of petered out after 8% in the landscape. So future research should try to find sites with more active management in the landscape, more young forest in the landscape to see if this is actually more of a linear trend or if it is indeed actually a quadratic effect. And then finally was the amount of impervious land cover in the landscape or urban land cover. We found that as urban land cover in the landscape increased, the probability of having whippoorwill occupy the site decreased. And it decreased pretty rapidly, right? You have almost a 5% probability of having a whippoorwill occupy the site at only 5% imperviousness in the landscape. So pretty negatively associated with urban land covers. So a negative relationship. And this could be the result of potentially light pollution. So this is what we're hypothesizing. There's a study in Europe on the European nightjar that found that the species could potentially be influenced by light pollution. And it makes sense for a species that requires the lunar illumination to forage, that potentially having too much light pollution in an area would influence its ability to forage. So something that's cool that can come from this occupancy research here is a predictive map. And this is just a map for Massachusetts. We have a map across our entire study area. But this is, I think, a great example here. So if we look at Massachusetts, in some of the areas that are hot spots in Massachusetts, so these red and orange areas, we see that this spot up here is called the Montague Plains Wildlife Management Area. It is an oak pitch pine community, has a ton of whippoorwill every year. Additionally, we have the Brimfield Tornado Path down here in this lower part of the state. This site was occupied by whippoorwill almost immediately after the tornado went through. And then finally, we have the Miles Standish Complex. This is a very large oak pitch pine community that is also loaded with whippoorwill. So what we're finding is that this map is pretty accurate, and if we compare it to eBird as well, our map is pretty consistent with eBird. So this is a pretty cool tool that land managers and conservation scientists can use to identify landscapes where management for whippoorwill would be most effective. Now we wanted to take this research one step further. And we wanted to identify what forest structural attributes resulted in high whippoorwill abundance. So go from occupancy to abundance. Without a doubt, if we want to conserve a species, we have to figure out how to create conditions that result in a very high density of the species. And from our occupancy research, there's really no remotely sensed data sets that get at forest structure. There are some that try. For example, the National Land Cover data set has the amount of scrub shrub in the landscape, right? But it doesn't do a very good job at classifying scrub shrub, and it oftentimes misclassifies some of our young forests as, say, herbaceous or another land cover. However, we were lucky, and Pennsylvania was flown for LiDAR relatively close to our survey. So between 2017 and 2020, Pennsylvania was flown for LiDAR. And what LiDAR is, or light detection and ranging, I could probably give you an entire presentation on what LiDAR is. So I'm just going to give a brief overview. So there's a sensor attached to the bottom of an aircraft, whether it be an airplane or a drone. And this sensor is emitting a ton of lasers really quickly, and those lasers are bouncing off objects down below. Um, and sending those bounced off lasers back up to the sensor, and then we get this 3D point cloud or a 3D representation of the physical environment. Now, in its raw form like this, it's not really of any use to conservation scientists or foresters. It's very data heavy, so we have to convert it into a usable form. So we have to rasterize these into structural metrics that we can actually use to identify structural associations. So the question is, can LiDAR inform species habitat requirements? So we have two pictures here. We have an aerial image of a landscape in Pennsylvania. This is a timber harvest that's outlined in red and a utility corridor that is delineated in yellow. And then we have the same exact landscape in the National Land Cover data set. You see that it does not quantify the utility corridor or the timber harvest at all. It does classify it as forest, which isn't necessarily incorrect. It is indeed forest. It's just a different age of forest, right? So it's not quantifying the structural conditions that we want. However, if we take a look at the same landscape with LiDAR, we can see that it does a great job at quantifying the utility corridor and the timber harvest. So yes, LiDAR can do a great job at quantifying structural characteristics of a forest. And this isn't anything new. We see this back as far as 2010 wildlife studies using LiDAR-derived metrics to inform species habitat requirements. And if we take a look at two publications out of my undergraduate lab, one was on the blue-winged warbler, and this is a young forest or shrubland-dependent species. And this study used LiDAR-derived metrics to assess vegetation structure within the species' home range. And they found that within core home ranges, so this area delineated in red here, these home ranges contain structural heterogeneity and short stature vegetation. They went on to say that these results suggest that although blue-winged warbler requires shrubland communities, the availability of adjacent forest cover that form structurally complex ecotones is also essential. A second study on the golden-winged warbler, this study used structural metrics derived from LiDAR to explain golden-winged warbler occupancy. This study found that LiDAR-derived covariates predicted occupancy much better than field-measured vegetation characteristics. So not only do we see that we can identify species structural associations, we can identify them at spatial extents that we cannot capture with a traditional vegetation survey, and LiDAR-derived covariates actually do a better job at predicting species associations than field-derived metrics. So LiDAR is proving to be a super valuable tool whenever it comes to informing management of wildlife. So for our research, we used 8 metrics. I don't have time to go into all of these metrics today, but I will give you a brief overview of what each group kind of means. We have P90. This is a metric of canopy height. These 3 variables are metrics of vertical structure. And then these last 4 variables are metrics related to horizontal structure. And then we extracted these variables at multiple spatial extents around each ARU location. So again, this data set was only available for Pennsylvania. So we had 636 points in Pennsylvania, and 226 were occupied by whippoorwill. And using abundance modeling, we were able to identify three LiDAR variables to influence whippoorwill abundance. First was P75, and what P75 is there's the height at which 75% of the returns fell below. So it's a way of kind of understanding the density of a forest. And we take across a 250-meter area, we average it, and then we get our average P75 for the survey location. So in this case, 250 meters was the spatial extent at which abundance was most influenced by P75. And we can see that it peaked at about 4.8 meters. Our second variable is the variation in canopy height, or P95, within 250 meters. And what this is just how much variation up and down there is in the canopy across a landscape. And this was at 250 meters. And we found that this peaked at 5 standard deviations. And then finally, the last variable was percent first hits between 1 and 5 meters. So at a 1 kilometer spatial extent. So what this is those sensors are getting shot out of, those lasers are getting shot out of that sensor. And what percent of the time is the laser, the first thing that laser is hitting between 1 and 5 meters? And that peaked at about 10%. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. I intentionally kind of went through these quick. These metrics are really hard to interpret. Even for myself and my co-authors, we go round and round about what these things actually mean in terms of forest structure. They're difficult to interpret, and we're working on trying to figure out the best way to interpret these variables and how we can interpret these variables. But for now, I can provide some LiDAR cookies. These two cookies right here are at 250 meter spatial extent. So this was the spatial extent at which variation in canopy height and P75 best predicted whippoorwill abundance. So on the left here, we have a high abundance landscape. So 5.22 whippoorwill, and on the right-hand side, we have a low predicted abundance landscape. And we can see how these landscapes vary, right? We have a overstory removal with a variable retention. It's also 2 ages here. We can see that kind of cloudiness underneath these trees of the understory vegetation, whereas over here it's clear. So this is a fresher harvest. You also have this ecotone with mature forests, whereas over here we just have a homogeneous closed canopy forest. So it makes sense that whippoorwill abundance would be highest in this young forest as it is a young forest dependent species. If we zoom out to 1 kilometer, we can see that again on the left-hand side, that landscape is actively managed. We can see again more overstory removals. So you have various stages of the shelterwood sequence. You have maybe a first entry shelterwood up here and down here. You have these kind of unique characteristic for this site is these grouse blocks. So these are 5-acre blocks that are harvested at varying scales temporally. And then you also have the riparian corridor and variable retention across these harvests. Whereas over here, it's just a homogeneous forest, right? So we can understand why this landscape would have a low predicted abundance. So this is a great way to kind of visualize these results, but we took our results one step further and we created another predictive map. This predicted map was informed by our occupancy study. So we only predicted across high occupancy landscapes. So within the landscape, so a lot of oak, very little imperviousness. So within these high occupancy landscapes, where do the structural conditions occur that result in high whippoorwill abundance? So if we take a look at this portion of Pennsylvania, we can see how a public and private land manager could use this tool to identify where on the landscape they should manage for whippoorwill. So, for example, these areas that are gray, it's a very poor landscape. Whippoorwill have a very low probability of occupying this landscape. I would not recommend managing in these gray areas. However, in these blue areas, it's not the right forest structure. It's the right landscape, but not the correct forest structure for the species. So we can go in here and manipulate these structural conditions with some sort of silvicultural prescription that results in high whippoorwill abundance. And we can see how a manager can inform their planning with this tool. And also from a conservation scientist standpoint, we can see how in this landscape here, they can identify where in the landscape we have a high abundance of whippoorwill. So say this timber harvest here. And we know that this timber harvest is eventually going to age out. So we know that if we want to keep this species on the landscape here, we're going to have to create more um, forest with the correct structure nearby this patch, so that these individuals have a place to go after this forest ages out. So, what I'm hoping that it's clear is that the whippoorwill needs diverse forest conditions. Both of our studies, I think, clearly demonstrated that the species requires diverse forest conditions, and this isn't necessarily true just for the whippoorwill. Um, I would argue that most, if not all, of our eastern forest bird species require diverse forest conditions. We're finding species that nest in mature forest, move to young forest during the post-fledging period, and then species that nest in young forest move to mid-successional and closed canopy forests during the post-fledging. So they're using multiple forest age classes across the year, right? While they're on the breeding grounds. And this isn't anything new. So for whippoorwill specifically, this need for diverse forest conditions is supported by past research. And then in terms of LiDAR, I hope I conveyed that LiDAR is a super valuable tool for foresters and conservation scientists. And without a doubt, it's tricky to interpret the variables right now, but undoubtedly it is a very important tool and a valuable tool. But we do realize that foresters need more than just values from remotely sensed data sets, right? If I went to a forester and I told them to go manage a landscape for a standard deviation of 5, in terms of canopy height, they would look at me like I had five heads, rightfully so. Um, however, at this point, our tools that we're creating, these maps that we're creating, are great tools for management planning, and hopefully in the future we're able to convert these LiDAR variables into silvicultural prescriptions that a forester can then implement on the landscape. And then I think I've done a pretty good job at really, showing that LiDAR is valuable, but it's also important to remember that site level vegetation surveys are still really important. The LiDAR that we used in this study um, wasn't a high enough quality to actually assess basal area and species composition, especially not species composition of regenerating trees, right? So site level vegetation surveys are still really important. And then for those of you who are interested in ARUs, I think this study is a great example of how ARUs have a ton of potential whenever it comes to monitoring wildlife. But just a cautionary tale is that these units require a ton of planning and organization. I wish it was as easy as just going out and hanging these things up on trees. However, there was a ton of planning that went into my master's research and organization. And after you've deployed all these units, there's even more planning and organization that you need to be ready for. We have a new set of challenges that we previously didn't have with point counts, right? These are challenges such as these are big data. You need powerful computing to actually process and move these recordings. And then you have to have the know-how to actually manipulate the data. Additionally, our results are not immediately in our hand after a field season. Whereas with a point count, you have the data sheet, it's entered into Excel. ARUs, you have a lag time between whenever you actually pull the units from the field and whenever you actually have data that you can actually use for analyses. And for those that are interested in ARUs or potentially are using ARUs, I really think this is a great tool. This is from our collaborators at the University of Pittsburgh. I highly suggest that everybody checks this out if you're using ARUs. This has information from everything about ARU microphones and batteries to how to deploy these units out in the field, how to process the recordings after you pull the units from the field. It's a super valuable tool that I highly recommend everybody check out. And then Well, I've been speaking about whippoorwill today. Our ARUs actually recorded for other time periods as well. So, um, with proper planning and ARU programming, you can monitor multiple taxa with a single deployment. So, our units also recorded and captured a daytime period. It was from 6:30 to 7:15. So, we have data from diurnal songbirds like so. And we have several projects that are using these data to better understand these species habitat requirements. We have two projects on the rough grouse. And hopefully those projects will be published in the very near future. We have a project that was recently published on barred owls. And then finally, we have a student working on a eastern gray tree frog project. And I think this is a really cool clip. It really shows how you can monitor multiple taxa with a single recording period, right? So if we listen closely, you can hear the eastern whippoorwill actually singing behind the frog. So I just want to take a second just to thank everyone who's been involved with this research. Without a doubt, it would not have been possible without really strong collaboration. So all of my collaborators, my technicians, as well as my funder, the Natural Resource Conservation Services Conservation Effects Assessment Project. And I'm happy to take any questions now, or feel free to shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to hop on a Zoom and talk about ARUs or remote sensing anytime.
Wow, thank you. Round of applause. I just don't remember your project being so huge. It's like across a huge landscape. It's so awesome. We did Eric threw in a question here, and I'll read it off for those who are watching the recording. Are you considering doing any multi-species occupancy modeling to assess how whippoorwills and other songbird species respond to vegetation characteristics? This might help justify certain types of management if target or non-target species are responding to similar vegetation characteristics.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yes, we are working on this, and so these are like community analyses using LiDAR and understanding how the forest bird community as a whole responds to different forest structural attributes, whether you have more rugosity or the variation in canopy height across a landscape or less rugosity, and understanding what that does to not only the occupancy of various species, but also the abundance of those species. So that is a project that is in the works currently, and hopefully that stuff will be made available soon as well.
Great. Michael Paling shoot a question out as, have you seen any forest managers, private or public, that have successfully used LiDAR and the predictive abundance maps in their silviculture prescriptions to benefit young forest species? And
So this is
I'll chime in here, Michael. I actually have seen this from a Bayfield County forester using it to kind of do a cruise of a site that he hasn't been to in a while, and it was very fascinating. But JT, I'll let you chime in too.
yeah. So this is all really new. I'm actually, still trying to wrap up the predictive map. I created this not that long ago, actually. So I haven't actually been had a chance to send this out to foresters yet to use, but the plan is yes, this will go out to anyone who would like to use this in the state, and hopefully we can eventually work with other states who have LiDAR to do similar analyses for them as well, for whippoorwill specifically. But yeah, my hope is that's my long-term vision is to see that these tools actually be used. But
Mhm.
right now we're in the very early stages of everything.
What platform are you hosting them on? Like R?
Yeah, so I'm creating them in R, and then really we haven't found a great way to share them yet. It's been if someone's interested in the say the predicted occupancy map, I get an email because there's a publication on it, and I'll share the layer with them. And then I've also shared it with some state agencies, so
Mm,
they have that and they can send it out as they wish. But
mhm.
yeah,
Great questions. Anyone else have a question or comment? I was, Mike Fitzgibbons is asking, what is minimum disturbance size for whippoorwill?
that's a great question. I wish I had a great answer for this, and it's kind of tricky because all of the shape files that we had for our projects they weren't super accurate. So we weren't able, in terms of occupancy, able to assess the patch size that results in highest occupancy of whippoorwill. Just because there's so many sites and aerial imagery, we would have had to there's going to be a long process to actually get the correct patch size for all of those sites. And our hope is that we can find a LiDAR variable. There's actually a layer that was recently created by um, it was published. It was a timber harvest layer in Pennsylvania that used LiDAR to map timber harvest across Pennsylvania. We're hoping we can use this layer, which seems pretty accurate in terms of identifying timber harvest, to actually identify the patch size that's required to result in high whippoorwill abundance. So that's the next step in our research. But I guess I can speak to a little bit further on that, I should say, is that a lot of our New England sites, so as you moved into New England Cottontail, uh, working lands for wildlife sites, which is New England, it's really New York, north to Maine. Those sites were a lot of clear cuts and they were smaller overall. You have smaller parcels in New England compared to as you move south. And it did seem like, just not not quantitatively speaking, that our larger sites in the south actually had higher occupancy than those in the north, which were smaller harvests. So
Mm,
um, I think the average size of a New England cottontail harvest was something. It was less than 15 acres. Whereas the golden wing warbler and cerulean warbler harvests were significantly larger than that. So
great. I'm wondering if anyone's using drones and LiDAR, because I know the aerial LiDAR, like the resolution isn't as high.
Mhm.
Have you seen any studies starting to use drone LiDAR?
Yeah, we actually have a couple studies that are starting to use drone LiDAR. They flew some stands, some timber harvest. I think it's both managed and unmanaged landscapes actually with a drone. So you have this really high quality LiDAR data set now that they're just beginning to work with. I think that was flown um, this winter, so it's pretty recent. So hopefully there's some stuff that comes from that.
Hmm. Very cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, if there is no last questions or comments, JT, I just want to say thank you so much for providing
Yeah.
this really thorough presentation. Oh, we had a question come in, but I really appreciate your time and effort into this. And it's really important for us to look into this research for putting conservation on the ground, especially I know you're out there in the East, but it's very pertinent for us here in the Midwest as well. Um, Brad Hutnick has a question on, seems like ARUs would be an interesting way to assess harvest effectiveness. Is anyone doing this?
Yeah. So we do actually have a study going on right now with monitoring golden wing warbler sites in
Hmm.
the Great Lakes region.
Mm,
So uh, yes, we have quite a few ARU projects now that are actually monitoring harvests and their effectiveness for focal species response, but also non-target species response. I think this is ARUs are really starting to develop into a great way to monitor for wildlife, especially for birds.
Hmm.
It's just still the challenge of processing these data that we're having. We don't have really a great method as to how we can process 1,263 ARUs in, say, an application or something like that. You really have to have the computer power to run the Python script and coding to actually get that done, which was not me, by the way. It was our collaborators at the University of Pittsburgh. They played a key role in actually being able to process our recordings. So, yeah,
Awesome. Yes, are those the RCPP sites for golden wing?
yes,
Yes,
yep, yep,
that's great. Really excited to eventually get results from those and see how the effectiveness of them on the private lands.
yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
Awesome.
Great. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you again. This has
Yeah,
been super informative, and our team is really excited that you came today.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Hmm.
It's always good to get to talk about your research. You put a lot of time into it, and
Hmm.
it's it feels good to actually be able to show some results to people and actually have like
Yes.
everyone excited about them. So I appreciate
Yeah.
everybody attending.
Well, thank you. You're welcome. Michael Paling's also excited about his landowner information from the RCPP.
Yeah,
They are.
hopefully get we get those letters together soon.
Hmm.
Awesome.
Very
Alrighty.
cool. Well, with that, thank you, everybody. Hope you have a good week. If you need credits, please fill out that form that I threw into the chat or send me an email. Thank you. Have a good day.